All right, let's talk about a policy that was supposed to be a win-win for India. A greener future, more energy independence, and a big boost for farmers. But it ended up sparking this huge controversy, leaving millions of people with busted engines and, lighter wallets. So what on earth went wrong? Let's get into India's great fuel debate.
Yeah, this is really the big question, right? Just imagine this for a second. The government tells you you have to use a new kind of fuel, and then you find out it's actually wrecking your car's mileage, maybe even damaging the engine, and you're paying more for it in the long run. Well, that's not a hypothetical. That's the reality for millions of people in India right now.
So what is this fuel that's causing all the chaos? It's called E20. And it's pretty simple, really. It's just regular petrol, but it's blended with 20% ethanol. Now, ethanol is basically a type of alcohol, usually made from sugarcane in India. And the big deal is, from April 2025, this wasn't an option. It became the mandatory fuel across the entire country.
Now, you got to understand, on paper, this policy looked great. It had some really big, some would say noble goals. This wasn't just some random change. No, this was pitched as a major leap forward for India's economy and the environment.
The government basically laid out 4 key reasons for doing this. First, they wanted to cut down on how much expensive oil India has to import. That's a huge drain on the economy, right? Second, by doing that, they'd save billions in foreign currency. That's a big win. Third, it was designed to be a direct shot in the arm for sugarcane farmers, creating this massive new market for their crops. And finally, the big one, lowering carbon emissions to help fight climate change. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
And the numbers they were putting out were pretty impressive. The government claimed that this whole ethanol program had saved India, get this, 1.44 lakh crore rupees. That's over $17 billion in foreign exchange over about 11 years. So you look at that and you think, wow, this policy is really delivering on its economic promises.
But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. While the big picture national balance sheet might have been looking rosy, for millions of regular people, car and bike owners, the situation on the ground was totally different. For them, this mandatory switch to E20 kicked off a personal economic crisis.
And this number is just wild. A huge nationwide survey found that a full 80%, that is 4 out of every 5 owners of vehicles made before 2023, said their mileage got worse after they switched to E20 fuel. People were literally getting less bang for their buck at the pump.
And we're not talking about a small drop here. The problem was pretty severe. Almost half of all owners, 45%, reported a 15 to 20% loss in fuel efficiency. Then you have another 16% who saw their mileage drop by more than 20%. For an average family, that means way more trips to the petrol pump and a real painful hit to the monthly budget.
But unfortunately, it got a lot worse than just bad mileage. See, ethanol can be corrosive to parts that weren't designed to handle it, and pretty soon reports of serious engine damage just started flooding in. We're talking about everything from failing fuel injectors, to engines misfiring, to fuel lines literally corroding from the inside. Even the fuel tanks themselves started deteriorating. These are not cheap fixes. These are expensive, super inconvenient repairs.
And this right here is the absolute core of the problem. The policy was rolled out for a massive fleet of vehicles that was just overwhelmingly not ready for it. We're talking over 234 million vehicles. That's more than 80% of all the petrol vehicles in India that were only built to handle maybe 5 or 10% ethanol, not 20. A huge compatibility crisis was pretty much guaranteed.
So, with all these problems popping up everywhere, people started asking some tough questions. Like, why was this policy pushed through so hard, especially when there were warnings about vehicle incompatibility? And this is where the story shifts, from being about a bad policy to a full-blown political firestorm, centering on some really serious allegations of a conflict of interest.
The spotlight quickly turned to a company called Cheyenne Agro Industries. Now, why them? Because it was managed by the son of the union minister who was the main champion for this E20 policy. And look at these numbers. In just 1 year, right as the policy was rolling out, the company's revenue just exploded. It went from 18 crore rupees to 523 crore. That is a jump of over 2,800%. Wow.
Well, that financial surge set off all kinds of alarm bells. The opposition's allegation was pretty direct. They claimed the policy was basically designed to make a small group of politically connected companies rich, including those tied to the minister's own family. They even demanded a formal investigation. The defense, though, they pushed back, and they pushed back hard. The minister's camp said, look, our family's companies are less than 0.5% of the total ethanol market. They also argued that big decisions on pricing and contracts are made by the entire cabinet, not just one minister. And they painted the critics as a huge lobby with their own interests in keeping oil imports high.
This whole mess eventually landed in the lap of India's Supreme Court. A petition was filed basically begging for consumer choice, asking for ethanol-free petrol to be made available. But the court ended up dismissing the challenge. They called the switch to E20 a logical progression. The only small win for consumers, the court ordered fuel stations to put up signs, telling people to check if their car is compatible. So millions of drivers were left to the warning, but absolutely no alternative.
So the policy was here to stay. And that brings us to the real heart of this entire debate, trying to weigh the big, claimed national benefits against the very real, very documented burdens that were placed on ordinary people.
Okay, so let's look at the balance sheet here. This is the central trade-off. On one side, you have the government's numbers, tens of thousands of crores in savings and payments to farmers, plus the environmental promise of reduced emissions. But on the other side, you've got the public's reality. A big drop in mileage, rising repair bills, and a hidden environmental cost we'll get to in a second. And maybe the most frustrating part for people, they were still paying the full price for petrol, even though 20% of what they were buying was actually cheaper ethanol.
Right, let's talk about that hidden environmental cost. Because while E20 is sold as green, making it from sugarcane is incredibly thirsty work. It takes roughly 2,000 liters of water just to produce a single liter of ethanol. Now, in a country that is already facing serious water stress, this raises some huge questions about how green this policy really is.
Okay, so given how widespread these problems are and all the controversy, what's the path forward? How do you fix this mess? Well, it can be really helpful to look at how other countries have handled a similar transition and what steps could actually work for India.
And a comparison with Brazil, which is pretty much the world leader in ethanol fuel, is really eye-opening. The difference in approach is just stark. Brazil gave its citizens a choice. They rolled out flex fuel cars over decades, gradually. Today, something like 83% of their new cars are flex fuel. India, on the other hand, just imposed a forced mandate on a fleet that was, as we saw, largely incompatible.
So, what would a better way forward actually look like? Well, experts and consumer groups have pretty much laid out a clear roadmap. Number one, and this is the big one, restore consumer choice. Let people buy ethanol-free E0 or lower blend E10 petrol if their vehicle needs it. Simple. Second, make the pricing transparent. If the fuel is diluted with 20% ethanol, it should be cheaper. Third, create some kind of system to compensate people who can prove their engines were damaged. And finally, you have to conduct a truly independent audit to figure out what the real financial and environmental impacts of this policy have been.
When you boil it all down, India's E20 fuel policy really leaves us with this one profound question. It's a classic case study of a top-down policy with these grand, national goals clashing directly with the wallets and the well-being of millions of individual citizens. And when that happens, who should be the one to bear the cost?